Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today into something that feels incredibly fundamental to being human. Forget the news cycle for just a moment. We're looking at the science behind protest. Why do we, as a species, have this seemingly inherent tendency to, challenge rules, to push back?
And what's really interesting, I think, is the source material guiding us today. It's an AI analysis that pulls insights from fields you might never have thought were connected to protesting.
Like what?
Well, we're talking biology, physics, philosophy, even mathematics.
Right, that's the mission here, isn't it? To sort of cut through the noise and extract the essential nuggets from this analysis.
Yeah, exactly.
To uncover the surprising, sometimes counterintuitive connections that explain why protest isn't just like a political tactic, but maybe a core part of the human condition.
Because it is universal. I mean, think about it. Protest appears in pretty much every culture, every historical era, across all demographics.
Yeah, that's true.
From ancient slave revolts to the civil rights movement, from student sit-ins to digital petitions today. The urge to dissent is always simmering, isn't it? Whether you've actually marched or signed something, or maybe just felt that gut reaction to an unfair rule. This deep dive is really about understanding a piece of yourself,
So let's start there then. This analysis makes a really strong case for the universal nature of dissent. It's always been with us.
Absolutely. And while the specific issues obviously change over time, the core driver identified in the analysis is remarkably consistent.
Which is?
It's a response to perceived injustice, a feeling that a rule or a system or just a situation fundamentally violates a deep sense of fairness.
Ah, okay.
And that feeling triggers a powerful demand for change.
That sense of fairness, the sort of outrage at injustice, where does that come from? I mean, is it learned?
Well, the analysis points to deep roots in our innate capacity for empathy and this evolutionary expectation of reciprocal altruism.
Reciprocal altruism, remind me.
Right. It's essentially the you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours principle.
Yeah.
Super key for social cooperation.
Okay.
When that principle is violated, when the game feels unfair, basically it taps into that fundamental human drive for equity. The analysis frames this as a cornerstone of human social evolution.
So we're kind of wired to some extent to notice and react to unfairness.
It seems that way, yeah.
And the ripple effects are just enormous, right? For an individual, actually acting on that perceived injustice can be incredibly transformative.
Oh, definitely. Turning someone into an agent of change.
Yeah, and for communities, it can forge these incredible bonds of solidarity. I mean, think of people literally putting their bodies on the line together.
But it can also cause painful divisions, too, let's be honest.
True. And on the global stage, the impact is just undeniable.
Right.
Protests have rewritten history, haven't they? Challenged empires, fundamentally shaped human rights.
Absolutely. And the world's response varies wildly, from brutal repression to grudging concessions or sometimes even genuine transformation.
Yeah.
It highlights that constant dynamic tension between established power and the persistent will of the people.
Okay, so it's universal. It's driven by this deep sense of fairness. But how exactly does this impulse manifest? This is where you said the AI analysis gets really interesting, using a multidisciplinary lens.
Exactly. You can't understand this complex phenomenon just by looking at politics or sociology alone.
You need to pull in insights from seemingly unrelated fields.
That's the idea.
So let's dig into some of the surprising areas the analysis touches on. First up, genetics and biology. Now, to be really clear, the analysis firmly states there's no single protest gene.
Right. Absolutely not. That would be way too simplistic. But what it does point to are genetic predispositions for traits that can influence our likelihood to participate or initiate dissent.
Like what kind of traits?
Things like variations related to aggression or risk-taking behavior, even levels of empathy. The analysis mentions variations in the MAOA gene, for instance.
MAO.
Yeah, it's linked to how we handle neurotransmitters related to mood and impulsivity.
Yeah.
It's definitely not a direct cause like this gene makes you protest.
Right.
But it might influence the likelihood of someone acting on a really strong feeling of injustice.
Okay, that makes an intuitive sense. I mean, some people are just naturally more risk-averse than others, aren't they?
Exactly.
But what about the biology of that outrage itself, that reaction to injustice we talked about?
This is one of those really fascinating nuggets from the analysis. It points to something called inequity aversion that scientists have observed in primates.
In monkeys?
Yeah, literally. Studies show monkeys will reject a reward, like, say, a piece of cucumber, if they see another monkey getting a much better reward, like a grape, for doing the exact same tasks.
No way. They get annoyed.
They totally do. It's like this primitive, seemingly hardwired reaction to unfairness. The analysis suggests this could be a potential biological basis for our own, much more sophisticated sense of injustice and the outrage it provokes.
So it might be built into us at a really basic biological level? Wow, that's pretty profound.
It is, isn't it? And hormones play a role too, apparently. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, that can be involved in fostering that crucial in-group solidarity you need for collective action. Makes sense. Meanwhile, cortisol, the stress hormone, can be a physiological response to the very oppressive or unjust conditions that might fuel protest in the first place. So our bodies are literally reacting to the system.
Okay, all right, shifting gears completely now. How does something as abstract as philosophy connect to the often messy reality of protests and challenging rules?
Well, protest is inherently tied up with questions of ethics and justice, right?
Sure.
The analysis highlights the concept of natural law. It's an idea with roots way back in ancient Greece with figures like Aristotle, and later refined by thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas. The core principle is actually quite powerful and simple. The idea is that there are universal moral truths, and any human-made law that violates these fundamental truths is, by definition, an unjust law. And as the philosophy goes, an unjust law is no law at all.
Wow. Okay, that provides the sort of philosophical bedrock for civil disobedience, doesn't it?
Exactly. And the analysis points straight to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail as a classic, incredibly powerful articulation of this very idea.
Right, I remember reading that.
He directly used the natural law argument to justify breaking segregation laws, stating one have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws.
That also raises really complex ethical questions, though, about the methods of protest. Is nonviolence always a moral imperative? What about disruptive tactics, or even violence?
Yeah, that's a huge part of the debate. The analysis notes that the logical arguments used to justify the protest's cause and the ethical arguments put forward for its methods are absolutely crucial factors in how successful and legitimate the protest is ultimately perceived to be.
So it's a constant negotiation, really, in the public eye and in philosophical terms.
Definitely.
Now, for the one that really surprised me when I saw it in the analysis outline, physics and mathematics. How on earth do you model something like a protest using equations?
Yeah, it sounds weird, but it's about viewing social phenomena through the lens of complex systems and network theory.
Okay.
The core idea the analysis draws on is that ideas, information, even behaviors can spread through a population a bit like an epidemic spreads through a susceptible host.
So dissent can literally be contagious.
In a way, yeah. You start with a small number of individuals who are ready to act. They're like the infected protesters in this model.
Right.
If the conditions are right, if the population is susceptible, maybe due to widespread grievances or that perceived injustice, we keep talking about the idea spreads through social networks, you can reach a tipping point, a threshold, where the collective behavior shifts really rapidly and suddenly a widespread movement emerges.
Like a kind of social chain reaction.
Precisely. And mathematical models, surprisingly, can borrow techniques directly from epidemiology, the study of disease spread, to simulate this.
What do they factor in?
Things like the initial spark, how connected people are in the network, how receptive they might be to the message, and even how authorities might try to contain the spread, almost like a societal immune response, trying to fight it off.
That's wild. The analysis also mentions using models from granular materials physics, like how sand behaves, to simulate crowd movement.
Yeah, that's a slightly different application. I guess that's less about the why of protest and more about the practical how.
Right, like maybe preventing dangerous crowd crushes or stampedes during large gatherings.
Exactly. It's applying physics principles to understand the physical dynamics of large groups of people, which becomes pretty critical in protest settings, unfortunately. It just shows the diverse ways science can intersect with this whole topic.
Okay, so beyond the biology and the math, what about the psychological state of the protesters themselves and the role of belief systems?
Yeah, the analysis really emphasizes several key psychological factors. A strong sense of collective identity, that feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself, is huge. Belief in the efficacy of their actions is also critical, that feeling that we can actually make a difference here.
Right, hope.
And powerful emotional responses, especially anger, often born from that perception of injustice.
Social psychology talks about things like groupthink or de-individuation in crowds, but the analysis also points out the incredible sense of empowerment that can come from collective action.
Oh, yeah. That feeling of strength and having a voice that you gain by standing together with others. It's powerful.
And historically, belief systems, both religious and secular, have been incredibly potent catalysts for protest, haven't they?
Absolutely. Massively influential.
Like the Protestant Reformation fundamentally challenging the established religious authority of the time.
Exactly that. And the analysis gives other examples, too, like religious institutions providing not just moral frameworks, but also vital structure, community, and even safe havens for movements.
Like the Black church during the American civil rights struggle.
Precisely. Or religious groups in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And on the other side, secular ideologies, like Marxism, for example, have also historically provided powerful frameworks inspiring revolutionary challenges to existing systems and rules.
So all of this diverse scientific and philosophical insight, it brings us back to a central idea in the analysis, that understanding protest is fundamentally tied to understanding the science of human rules itself.
That's right. Humans are inherently rule-making, rule-following creatures. I mean, we have to be. It's essential for cooperation, for building any kind of complex society.
We're talking laws, regulations.
Yeah, formal legal systems, but also just the informal social norms that guide our behavior every day.
So the deep dive into the science of protest helps us understand when those essential rules are perceived as breaking that innate sense of fairness, maybe becoming illegitimate in people's eyes.
And triggering that deep-seated human impulse to challenge them.
Yeah. It seems like a truly healthy, resilient society needs a kind of dynamic equilibrium.
That's a good way to put it. It needs the stability that rules provide, definitely. But it also needs the capacity for growth and adaptation that comes from challenging rules that are unjust or outdated, or simply no longer serving the common good.
So, pulling all these different scientific threads together from the analysis, what are the core reasons it identifies for why humans tend to break or challenge rules?
Okay, so the analysis lays out several key drivers, and they link back nicely to what we've been discussing. First and foremost is that perceived injustice violating that hardwired sense of fairness and reciprocal altruism.
That seems to be the bedrock.
It really does. And a big one also is lack of voice. If people feel they have no legitimate channels within the system to express grievances, to be heard, or to influence the rules.
They go outside the system.
Exactly. They're far more likely to step outside the system to challenge it.
Yeah.
It feels like the system just isn't listening,
Makes sense. What else?
Another reason is when rules are perceived as a direct threat to identity or even survival, maybe menacing a community's culture, its economic security, or its physical safety.
Okay.
Then there's psychological reactance. That's an interesting one. It's that kind of automatic pushback, that urge to resist. When you feel your freedom or autonomy is being threatened or taken away by a rule.
Like, don't tell me what to do.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, social influence. The power of group dynamics, that sort of epidemic spread of ideas we talked about with the physics models, peer pressure, collective identity, all that plays a massive role in mobilizing individuals to challenge rules together.
Okay, let's try and ground this with a specific example of a human rule that's currently debated and challenged, which the analysis actually uses. Mandatory retirement for important government positions.
Yeah, this is a perfect illustration of a rule that really sparks that tension between stability and the need for challenge.
So what are the arguments for it, according to the analysis?
Well, the analysis presents the common arguments. Things like opening up opportunities for younger generations, mitigating potential risks from cognitive decline in really demanding roles,
Right.
and preventing the entrenchment of power by ensuring there's a regular sort of systemic refresh.
But the arguments against it are powerful too, and you can hear echoes of those reasons for challenging rules we just listed.
Definitely.
It's seen by many as straightforward age discrimination, a clear perceived injustice right there.
Mm-hmm.
There's the argument about losing valuable experience and institutional knowledge when experienced people are forced out.
Huge loss, potentially.
And the fundamental democratic argument that age shouldn't be some arbitrary cutoff, that voters should be free to choose based on competence, not just date of birth.
Exactly. The challenge to this rule often stems from that perceived injustice, the potential threat to identity for experienced individuals, and maybe a feeling that the rule limits fundamental freedoms, hitting several of those scientific reasons for rule breaking we discussed.
And the source, the AI analysis, it proposes a kind of proper human rule for this specific issue, guided by what it calls systemic thinking. What does that look like?
Yeah, so instead of a rigid one-size-fits-all age limit, the analysis suggests a more nuanced approach.
How so?
Maybe potentially combining things like independent cognitive assessments for specific high-level roles, perhaps implementing term limits to address the power entrenchment issue more directly,
Okay.
and definitely investing in robust succession planning to ensure that institutional knowledge isn't just lost but actively transferred. It's an attempt to find that equilibrium, balancing the need for fresh perspectives with the value of experience.
So circling back a bit, what exactly is this systemic thinking that the analysis keeps pointing to as being so crucial?
It's fundamentally a holistic way of looking at things. Instead of viewing protests as just an isolated event or maybe just a problem to be suppressed.
Right.
Systemic thinking sees it as a feedback mechanism within a larger societal system.
Like the system itself is sending up a flare, a signal that something's wrong.
Precisely. It forces you to look beyond the surface symptom, the protest itself, and examine the underlying structures, the interconnected parts, the patterns over time, and the larger context that are actually causing that signal.
So it's about understanding the dynamics, not just reacting to the flare-up in the moment.
That's the core idea, yeah.
Okay, so if we understand protests through this multidisciplinary systemic lens, what does the analysis suggest in terms of, say, potential improvements or ways to mitigate the conditions that lead to unrest in the first place?
Well, the analysis shifts from simply describing protests to suggesting some proactive systemic strategies. One key recommendation is for governance itself to embrace systemic thinking, moving away from purely reactive crisis management towards actively addressing the root causes of societal stress and perceived injustice before they boil over.
So instead of just reacting to protests after they happen, you look at why the system is generating that level of discontent in the first place.
Exactly right. Another major one is fostering truly inclusive and participatory governance.
Giving people a voice.
Yes, creating genuine, effective channels for public voice. The analysis suggests this acts like a crucial safety valve. It allows grievances to be heard, debated, and hopefully addressed within the system.
Reducing the pressure that builds up and often leads to explosive protests later.
Promoting education in critical thinking and media literacy is also highlighted as important.
Why that?
Well, an informed population, one that's capable of discerning truth from disinformation, is generally better equipped to engage in constructive dialogue and identify legitimate grievances rather than perhaps being manipulated into unproductive or even harmful dissent.
That makes sense. What else?
Strengthening institutions of justice and accountability is seen as vital. When legal and political systems are perceived as fair, as transparent, and as consistently applied.
People trust them more.
Right, and it reduces that powerful driver of protest. The feeling of impunity or the sense that the system is rigged against ordinary people.
And finally, the analysis mentions investing in social cohesion and empathy-building initiatives.
Yeah, things like reducing extreme inequality, actively promoting understanding across different groups, strengthening community bonds. These efforts basically build a more resilient social fabric.
Making it less prone to fragmentation and widespread unrest when challenges inevitably arise.
Exactly.
Now, the analysis is clear that we're not at a point where we can precisely predict human behavior with mathematical models.
Oh, definitely not. Humans are far too complex for that, at least for now.
Yeah.
But there are logical arguments and modeling concepts that strongly support these kinds of proactive strategies.
Like the logic of prevention you mentioned earlier.
Right. The analysis argues it's not just logically sound, but also economically and socially far more beneficial in the long run to invest in preventing the conditions that cause widespread protest.
So, addressing inequality, ensuring people have a voice, providing fair systems.
Yeah, all that is ultimately less costly than bearing the enormous costs of social unrest, which include everything from economic disruption right through to, tragically, human lives lost.
That seems undeniable when you put it like that. And what about game theory? How does that fit in?
Well, game theory, which models strategic interactions between rational actors, often shows that cooperative strategies, those based on fairness, mutual benefit, predictable rules, tend to be more stable and lead to better outcomes for everyone involved over the long haul.
Okay.
The analysis uses a really powerful analogy here. It frames a society that consistently violates fairness, ignores grievances, and lacks accountability as essentially a rigged game.
And in a rigged game, what do people do?
Players are incentivized to flip the table. They see no benefit, no point in continuing to play by rules that are fundamentally stacked against them.
Flipping the table, wow, that's a perfect, almost visceral image for understanding the ultimate act of protest, isn't it?
It really captures that breaking point, I think.
So pulling all these threads together from the AI analysis, the biology, the physics, the philosophy, the psychology, the science of human protest isn't some simple formula we can just write down.
Not at all. It's an ongoing, incredibly complex dialogue.
A conversation, you said earlier, sometimes maybe a shouting match between the governed and those who govern.
Yeah, between the needs of the individual and the demands of the collective group.
And ultimately, this deep dive into the fundamental science reminds us that the impulse to protest, that refusal to just passively accept injustice, is a deeply rooted, perhaps even inherent, part of who we are as humans.
And by understanding these underlying scientific and philosophical drivers, the hope is, I suppose, that we can move towards building societies where protest is less a desperate last resort born of ignored grievances.
And more a dynamic, maybe even healthy, part of a system that adapts and evolves.
Exactly. A world where the rules we live by better reflect our shared humanity and that universal yearning for fairness and justice.
It really leaves you contemplating that delicate balance in every aspect of life, doesn't it? The need for rules, for structure, versus the fundamental human need to challenge them when they feel fundamentally wrong.
This is DigitView.